The rules were still written down. The schedules were still posted. The routines still looked the same. Yet something was missing. No one corrected small mistakes. No one followed up. No one returned to see if anything had been done the way it was supposed to be. The rules had not disappeared, but the moment they stopped being checked, they began to change what they meant, and that quiet shift altered daily life inside the camp more than any order ever had. For a long time, the rules had defined everything inside the camp. They were posted, repeated, and remembered, shaping how men moved, spoke, and organized their days. Even when supervision weakened, the rules themselves did not vanish. They remained visible, unchanged in form, preserved on paper and in memory, as if permanence alone could sustain them. At first, the men assumed the absence of checking was temporary. A delayed inspection, an understaffed shift, a momentary lapse in attention. They continued to follow procedures carefully, expecting correction to return at any moment. Beds were arranged as before. Lines formed with familiar precision. Tasks were completed according to instructions that had not been revised. The rules still felt active because habit continued to enforce them internally. But days passed and nothing followed. Small deviations went unnoticed. A task completed later than scheduled brought no response. A procedure skipped out of convenience produced no consequence. The rules remained visible, yet they no longer reached outward to meet behavior. They existed without presence, and that distinction slowly became impossible to ignore. This absence of confirmation created a subtle tension. Rules had once functioned as a dialogue between authority and action. An instruction was followed, and response confirmed its importance. Without that response, the dialogue broke down. The men found themselves acting according to rules that no longer answered back. Obedience began to feel strangely hollow. Some prisoners tested the boundaries without intending to. A step was skipped. A tool was left out of place. A formality was ignored. Each time, the result was the same. Nothing happened. The absence of reaction did not feel liberating. It felt destabilizing. Rules without enforcement did not grant freedom. They removed certainty. Gradually, the men began to question not the fairness of the rules, but their relevance. If no one checked compliance, did compliance still matter? The question did not arise as rebellion, but as confusion. The structure that once gave shape to effort had weakened, leaving behind instructions that no longer carried weight through action. Inside the barracks, conversations reflected this uncertainty. Men spoke quietly about what still mattered and what had not openly challenging the system, but attempting to interpret it. The lack of clarity forced interpretation to replace instruction. Each man formed his own sense of where the boundaries now lay, and those boundaries differed slightly from one person to the next. This individual interpretation marked an important shift. Rules had once been external, shared, and enforced. Now they became internal, uneven, and flexible. The camp still looked orderly from a distance, but up close, behavior had begun to diverge. Precision softened. Formality became selective. Compliance depended less on obligation and more on convenience. The guards, still present but distant, did not intervene. Their silence reinforced the change. Without correction, the rules lost urgency. They remained part of the environment, but no longer shaped it decisively. The men sensed that the system had entered a passive phase, one where structure existed without intention. By the end of this stage, the rules had not been broken. They had been hollowed out. They remained visible and familiar, yet their influence had weakened. What once directed behavior now hovered above it, disconnected from consequence. The men had not rejected the rules. They had begun to live alongside them, adjusting quietly to a world where rules still existed, but no one seemed to be checking anymore. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the absence of checking continued, the rules began to separate from behavior in quiet but noticeable ways. They were still referenced, still remembered, still spoken about as if they mattered. Yet the connection between rule and action had weakened. Compliance was no longer automatic. It became conditional, shaped by circumstance rather than obligation. At first, this shift was nearly invisible. Men followed most procedures as before, but with small adjustments. A task might be completed later than prescribed. A formality might be shortened. These changes were not deliberate acts of defiance. They were practical responses to a system that no longer responded in return. When nothing followed compliance, compliance stopped demanding precision. Each man began to make subtle calculations, not about whether to obey, but about how closely obedience needed to resemble the original instruction. The rules still existed, but they no longer answered questions about priority. Without oversight, effort was measured against necessity rather than correctness. What mattered was getting through the day, not honoring procedures that no longer produce consequence. This individual calibration introduced quiet variation into daily life. One man followed the rules strictly out of habit. Another followed them loosely, adjusting as needed. A third followed only what felt essential. None of these choices were discussed openly. They emerged naturally, shaped by personal tolerance and fatigue. The shared structure that once unified behavior began to fragment. The emotional impact of this change was subtle but persistent. Rules had once offered reassurance. They told the men where limits were and what was expected. Now those signals were unreliable. Without consistent enforcement, the men no longer knew which actions truly mattered. This uncertainty created unease, not because the rules were harsh, but because they were unclear in their relevance. Social dynamics shifted in response. Men observed one another more carefully, trying to gauge how far others were going, not to enforce compliance, but to orient themselves. If one man relaxed a rule without consequence, others noticed. Slowly, the strictest interpretations lost influence, replaced by the most common behaviors. Normality was redefined by repetition rather than instruction. The guards, still present at a distance, contributed to this ambiguity. Their occasional appearances did not restore clarity. Inspections were irregular and superficial. Corrections, when they occurred, addressed only the most visible issues. This inconsistency reinforced the sense that rules were no longer actively maintained. They existed, but they were not being defended. As days passed, the men adjusted emotionally. Anxiety about making mistakes lessened, not because mistakes were forgiven, but because they were ignored. The fear of doing something wrong faded into indifference. Without feedback, effort felt arbitrary. The safest approach became doing enough to avoid attention, but not more. Time amplified this effect. Repetition without response trained the men to conserve energy. Why invest attention in precision when precision produced no difference? The rules still framed the day, but they no longer demanded engagement. They became background elements, part of the scenery rather than active forces. By the end of this phase, the rules had not collapsed. They had become optional in practice, even if mandatory in name. The camp still appeared orderly, but order now rested on convenience rather than obligation. Compliance was no longer shared or absolute. It was negotiated privately, moment by moment. This transformation did not feel like freedom. It felt like drift. Without clear enforcement, the rules lost their power to anchor behavior. What replaced them was not chaos, but quiet individual judgment, uneven and unstable. The men continued to live within the same physical boundaries, but internally They had begun to navigate a different landscape, one where rules still existed, but their meaning depended entirely on whether anyone chose to check them. As the rules became optional in practice, they also began to lose a shared meaning. What had once been understood uniformly across the camp now fractured into personal interpretations. The words on paper remained unchanged, but their significance varied from man to man. A rule no longer described what must be done. It described what might be done, depending on circumstance. This shift created a quiet instability. When rules are enforced, disagreement is minimal because authority resolves uncertainty. When enforcement fades, uncertainty spreads. The men found themselves navigating not only the rules, but one another's interpretations of them. A behavior that felt acceptable to one man felt risky to another. Without a common standard, predictability weakened. At first, this ambiguity demanded attention. Men watched how others behaved, adjusting their own actions accordingly. If a shortcut went unnoticed, it became more acceptable. If a relaxed procedure became common, it slowly replaced the original instruction. Over time, the version of the rule that survived was not the one written down, but the one most frequently practiced. This process changed the social atmosphere inside the camp. Rules had once acted as neutral reference points, removing personal judgment from daily interaction. Now, judgment returned indirectly. Men noticed who followed which version of the rules and adapted their behavior to avoid standing out. Conformity shifted from obedience to alignment with the most common behavior. The emotional cost of this shift was subtle but real. Living under enforced rules had been restrictive, but it had also been clear. Living under optional rules required constant adjustment. Each man had to decide how much effort to invest, how closely to follow procedure, and how visible his choices should be. This quiet decision-making consumed energy that routine once preserved. Over time, many men simplified their approach. They followed rules loosely enough to blend in, but not closely enough to feel burdened by precision. This compromise reduced effort and avoided attention. It was not chosen consciously. It emerged naturally as the most sustainable way to live in an environment where enforcement was uncertain. As shared meaning weakened, the rules lost their role as moral boundaries. They no longer represented right and wrong, only habit and convenience. Breaking a rule did not feel transgressive if no one reacted. Following a rule did not feel virtuous if it brought no acknowledgement. The emotional weight once attached to compliance faded. Authority, though still present, no longer anchored interpretation. Guards moved through the camp without clarifying expectations. Their silence reinforced the idea that exact compliance no longer mattered. This absence of guidance left the men alone with their judgments, and those judgments varied widely. Gradually, the rules stopped organizing the day in a meaningful way. They remained part of the camp structure, but they no longer unified behavior. Each man carried a slightly different version of what was acceptable. The camp still functioned, but it did so through habit rather than shared understanding. This fragmentation did not produce conflict. It produced distance. Without common standards, interaction became cautious and limited. Men avoided commenting on one another's behavior because no one could be certain which version of the rules applied anymore. Silence replaced correction. Indifference replaced clarity. By the end of this phase, the rules had lost their collective force. They still existed, but they no longer meant the same thing to everyone. What had once provided order now floated above daily life, disconnected from consequence and shared belief. The men continued to live under the same regulations, but those regulations no longer anchored them together. This was a critical turning point. When rules lose shared meaning, they no longer shape community. They become background noise, visible but ineffective. And in that quiet erosion, the camp moved closer to a state where rules existed only as symbols, no longer capable of guiding behavior or creating coherence, preparing the way for the next phase, where even the idea of rules would begin to fade from awareness. As shared meaning dissolved, the rules themselves began to recede from conscious attention. They did not disappear, and they were not formally removed. They simply stopped occupying space in the mind. What had once required awareness, memory, and adjustment now existed only as faint reference points, noticed occasionally but rarely engaged with directly. The men no longer thought in terms of following or breaking rules. Instead, they acted according to what felt normal in the moment. Behavior was guided by rhythm rather than regulation. If something fit smoothly into the day, it was done. If it required effort without clear purpose, it was set aside. The rules no longer framed decisions. They lingered behind them. This shift altered how time was experienced. Earlier phases of captivity had been marked by structure, then by uncertainty, then by quiet negotiation. Now time flattened further. Days passed without internal checkpoints. Without rules demanding attention, there was little to mark progress or deviation. Life became a sequence of moments rather than a path shaped by instruction. The physical reminders of regulation remained visible. Signs stayed posted. Schedules remained written. Procedures were still technically in effect. Yet these markers no longer shaped behavior unless they aligned with convenience. The presence of rules without engagement turned them into static objects rather than active forces. Emotion responded to this backgrounding in subtle ways. The tension once associated with compliance faded, but it was not replaced by relief. Instead, there was a muted neutrality. Without rules to push against or rely upon, emotional energy declined. Effort felt unnecessary. Precision felt optional. The men conserved themselves by narrowing attention to what required immediate response. Social interaction reflected this narrowing. Conversations avoided reference to rules altogether. There was no need to debate them, reinterpret them, or enforce them. They no longer played a role in shared life. Interaction focused on practical matters and immediate needs, leaving regulation untouched and unexamined. The guards, still present at intervals, did not reverse this condition. Their occasional checks addressed surface order rather than substance. As long as the camp appeared functional, deeper disengagement went unnoticed. This reinforced the sense that rules existed only for appearance, not for lived experience. Over time, the men adjusted fully to this state. They did not feel rebellious or compliant. They felt detached. The rules were no longer something to respond to. They were part of the scenery, like fences that defined space but no longer demanded thought. Awareness shifted inward toward endurance rather than alignment. This detachment carried a quiet cost. Rules had once provided a framework that connected individual actions to a larger system. Without that framework, actions felt isolated. Doing something correctly or incorrectly no longer carried meaning beyond the moment itself. The sense of participating in an ordered environment weakened, replaced by simple continuation. By this stage, the rules had lost their psychological presence. They still existed formally, but they no longer shaped identity, behavior, or interaction. The men moved through days without referencing them internally. Regulation had become invisible, not because it was absent, but because it no longer mattered enough to notice. This was not chaos. It was absence, an environment where rules remained intact on paper, yet absent from experience. The camp continued to function outwardly, but inwardly it had entered a quieter phase, one where instruction no longer organized life, and where the idea of being governed had faded into the background, preparing the way for the final transformation that followed when even memory of the rules began to loosen. Once the rules faded into the background, something deeper followed. They were no longer considered, referenced, or quietly negotiated. They were simply forgotten in daily experience. Not erased, not rejected, but absent from awareness. The men did not wake each morning thinking about what was permitted or forbidden. They woke thinking only about the day ahead. Behavior adjusted accordingly. Actions were no longer measured against instruction, but against necessity. If something needed to be done to pass the day, it was done. If it did not, it was ignored. The distinction between following rules and ignoring them no longer existed internally. The men acted without framing their behavior in those terms at all. This shift altered how effort was distributed. Precision disappeared where it offered no immediate benefit. Care remained only where it preserved comfort or avoided visible disruption. Without rules to justify extra attention, energy was conserved instinctively. The men did not feel lazy or negligent. They felt efficient in a narrowed sense, focused only on what allowed continuity. Emotion followed the same pattern. There was little frustration and little relief. Feelings flattened into a steady, neutral state. Without rules to push against or comply with, emotional reactions lost direction. The men were no longer responding to authority, nor reacting to its absence. They existed in a space where reaction itself was unnecessary. Social relationships reflected this quiet disengagement. There was no shared discussion about how things should be done because there was no shared reference point left. Interaction centered on immediate coordination rather than shared standards. Men coexisted without shaping one another's behavior, each navigating the day privately within the same physical space. The guards, still present in form, had become part of the background as well. Their movements no longer altered behavior. They were noticed but not anticipated. Authority existed at a distance, detached from daily experience. The men did not feel watched or unwatched. The question itself no longer mattered. Time reinforced this condition. Days passed without internal markers. Without rules to structure experience, time flattened into repetition. The men did not measure progress or decline. They simply continued. Survival did not require reflection, only persistence. By this stage, the camp functioned without psychological regulation. Order existed superficially, but internally, life had narrowed to endurance. The men were not free, but they were no longer constrained by the idea of rules. They lived within the same boundaries, but without referencing the system that had once defined those boundaries. This was the final transformation. Rules still existed somewhere, written down, posted, remembered by others. But for the men living inside the camp, they had ceased to matter. Life continued without them, not in defiance, but in quiet detachment. And in that detachment, the camp reached its most silent state yet. Not controlled, not liberated, but sustained by habit alone, moving forward through days that no longer asked for obedience because obedience itself had quietly disappeared from awareness. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the disappearance of the rules from daily life. They were not removed, challenged, or overturned. They simply stopped being part of how the men experienced the world. Life inside the camp continued without reference to what was once required, guided instead by habit and necessity. The men did not feel liberated, and they did not feel controlled. They existed in a narrow space where effort was carefully measured and attention was directed only toward what allowed the day to pass. The rules still existed somewhere beyond their awareness, but they no longer shaped behavior, identity, or meaning. What remained was a quiet form of endurance. Days followed one another without expectation, correction, or confirmation. The camp still functioned, routines still unfolded, and life moved forward without interruption. And in that silent continuation, the rules had lost their final hold, not because they were broken, but because no one checked them anymore, and eventually, no one remembered to look. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.